There is a moment in history that changed everything about who controls the Americas. It happened in 1895. Most people have never heard of it. There were no battles, no one fired a shot. But in that year, the United States looked at the British Empire, the most powerful nation on earth, and said, get out of our hemisphere. And the British left. This was not a polite diplomatic disagreement. This was an ultimatum backed by the threat of war. The American president told the British Prime Minister that if Britain did not withdraw from a border dispute in South America, the United States would go to war to force them out. And the shocking part is that Britain, which had the largest navy in the world and ruled a quarter of the earth, backed down. They accepted American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. They acknowledged that the New World belonged to Washington, not London. This confrontation was called the Venezuela crisis, but it was not really about Venezuela. It was about gold. It was about empire, and it was about the moment when America stopped being a former colony and became an imperial power itself. This is the story of how the Monroe Doctrine, a piece of paper written 70 years earlier, became a loaded gun. And in 1895, America pulled the trigger. To understand why this crisis mattered, you need to understand what Venezuela represented in the 1890s. Venezuela was not important because of its people or its culture or its government. It was important because of what was buried in its mountains: gold. In 1849, prospectors had found gold deposits in a remote region called the Guiana Highlands, on the border between Venezuela and British Guiana. British Guiana was a small colony on the northern coast of South America. It had been British since 1814, after the Napoleonic Wars. The colony was tiny, mostly jungle and swamp. It produced some sugar and not much else. But when gold was discovered, everything changed. Suddenly, this piece of jungle became valuable. The problem was that no one knew exactly where the border was. The maps were vague. The region was unexplored. Both Venezuela and Britain claimed the gold fields. For decades, this was a minor dispute. Venezuela would protest. Britain would ignore them. Venezuela had no power to enforce its claim. Britain had the Royal Navy. The issue seemed settled by force, not law. But then something unexpected happened. An American got involved. William Scruggs was a former American diplomat who had served as the U.S. minister to Venezuela. After leaving government service, he became a lobbyist. In 1894, the Venezuelan government hired him to make their case to the American public. They wanted the United States to pressure Britain to negotiate. Scruggs was a skilled propagandist. He wrote a pamphlet with a brilliant title, British Aggressions in Venezuela or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial. He printed thousands of copies and sent them to every congressman, every newspaper, every influential figure in America. The pamphlet framed the dispute in a way that made American blood boil. It said that Britain was not just taking land from Venezuela. Britain was violating the Monroe Doctrine, and if America let that happen, the doctrine was meaningless. The Monroe Doctrine had been announced in 1823 by President James Monroe. It was a bold statement. It said that the Americas were closed to European colonization. Any attempt by a European power to establish new colonies or interfere in the affairs of independent nations in the Western Hemisphere would be considered an act of aggression against the United States. When Monroe first announced this, it was seen as a joke. America, in 1823, was a small agricultural nation with no navy. Britain had just defeated Napoleon. The idea that America could tell Europe what to do was absurd. But Monroe was planting a seed. He was claiming that the Americas were America's sphere of influence. For 70 years, the doctrine was mostly ignored. European powers did what they wanted. France invaded Mexico in the 1860s. Spain tried to reclaim parts of South America. Britain expanded its territories in Central America and the Caribbean. America complained, but did nothing. America was busy with its own expansion, fighting Mexico, fighting itself in the Civil War, settling the West. But by the 1890s, everything had changed. By 1895, the United States had become an industrial colossus. It had the largest economy in the world. It had railroads spanning the continent. It had steel mills in Pittsburgh and oil fields in Texas. It had a growing sense that it was destined to be a great power. The generation that came of age after the Civil War was hungry for recognition. They looked at Britain and France and Germany carving up Africa and Asia, and they felt left out. They wanted an empire too, but there was a problem. All the good colonies were taken, Africa was divided, Asia was claimed, the Pacific Islands were occupied. Where could America expand? The answer was obvious: South America. The Monroe Doctrine gave America a legal justification. We are not conquering, we are protecting, we are defending the sovereignty of our neighbors against European aggression. It was imperialism with a moral disguise, and Venezuela was the perfect test case. When Scruggs published his pamphlet, it landed on the desk of Richard Olney, the U.S. Secretary of State. Olney was a corporate lawyer from Boston. He was aggressive, blunt, and deeply nationalist. He read the pamphlet and saw an opportunity. He decided to force the issue with Britain. In July 1895, Olney sent a note to the British government. It was one of the most arrogant diplomatic communications in American history. He demanded that Britain submit the Venezuela border dispute to international arbitration. But the real message was in the language he used. He wrote that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent and its fiat is law. He said that American power and resources made it master of the situation. He invoked the Monroe Doctrine and said that any European interference in the Americas was a threat to American security. The tone was not diplomatic. It was a declaration of dominance. Olney was telling Britain that the Western Hemisphere was now an American sphere of influence and Britain needed to accept that or face consequences. The note sat on the desk of the British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury for 4 months. Salisbury was in no hurry to respond. Britain was dealing with crises in Africa and Asia. A border dispute in the jungle of South America seemed trivial. When Salisbury finally replied in November, his response was dismissive. He rejected arbitration. He said Britain had clear legal and historical rights to the disputed territory. And then he made a fatal mistake. He said that the Monroe Doctrine was not recognized in international law. He said it had no legal standing. He essentially told America that their doctrine was irrelevant. This was a massive miscalculation. Salisbury did not understand that the Monroe Doctrine had become a sacred text in American politics. Questioning it was like questioning the Constitution. When President Grover Cleveland received Salisbury's reply, he was furious. Cleveland was not a warmonger. He was a cautious conservative Democrat. But he was also a proud nationalist. He decided to escalate. On December 17, 1895, Cleveland sent a special message to Congress. He read Salisbury's rejection of the Monroe Doctrine and called it unacceptable. Then he made a shocking proposal. He asked Congress to authorize a commission to investigate the Venezuela border and determine the true boundary line. And then he said that once the commission determined where the border should be, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any appropriation by Great Britain of territory beyond that line. Every means in its power meant war. Cleveland was saying that if Britain took land that America decided belonged to Venezuela, America would go to war with Britain to stop it. The reaction in Congress was electric. Normally divided on everything, Congress erupted in bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans stood and cheered. The authorization passed almost unanimously. America was ready to fight the British Empire over a jungle in South America that most Americans could not find on a map. The American press went into a frenzy. Newspapers screamed that British arrogance had to be checked. Editorials called for war. Theodore Roosevelt, who was then a young politician in New York, wrote to a friend saying that he hoped there would be a fight. He said a war with Britain would be a great benefit to America because it would prove American power. The war fever was real. Volunteers began offering to enlist. State militias prepared to mobilize. The stock market crashed. Investors panicked at the thought of a war between the two largest economies in the world. In Britain, the reaction was very different. At first, there was anger. The British press called America upstart and insolent. They mocked the idea that the United States could challenge the Royal Navy, but then the British government looked at the strategic situation and realized they had a serious problem. Britain was already overstretched. They were managing crises in South Africa with the Boers. They were dealing with tensions in Egypt and Sudan. They were competing with Russia in Central Asia and with France in Africa. They were watching the rise of Germany with growing alarm. Germany was building a navy and challenging British dominance in Europe. Britain could not afford to fight America at the same time. A war with the United States would require moving the Royal Navy. Across the Atlantic, it would leave Britain vulnerable everywhere else. And for what? A strip of jungle that Britain did not really need. The British cabinet met and did a cold cost-benefit analysis. Fighting America would cost billions and gain nothing. Negotiating would cost nothing and preserve the relationship with a nation that was becoming a critical economic partner. Britain was importing massive amounts of American wheat, cotton, and oil. American capital was financing British industry. The two economies were deeply intertwined. Lord Salisbury swallowed his pride. In January 1896, Britain agreed to arbitration. They said they would accept a neutral commission to determine the border. It was a complete retreat. Britain had blinked. The arbitration process took 3 years. A tribunal of international judges met in Paris to review the evidence. In 1899, they issued their ruling. The border was drawn mostly in favor of Britain. Venezuela got some territory but not the gold fields. On paper, Britain won the dispute, but in reality, Britain had lost something far more important. They had lost their unchallenged dominance in the Americas. By agreeing to arbitration under American pressure, Britain had acknowledged that they could not act unilaterally in the Western Hemisphere anymore. They had accepted that America had a veto. The Venezuela crisis was the moment when the British Empire began its retreat from the Americas. Over the next 20 years, Britain would withdraw from the Caribbean, cancel plans for a Central American canal, and defer to American leadership in the region. The United States replaced Britain as the dominant power, and America made sure everyone knew it. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt expanded the Monroe Doctrine with what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. He said that not only would the U.S. prevent European powers from intervening in Latin America, but America itself had the right to intervene to maintain order. It was a blank check for American imperialism. The U.S. used this justification to invade and occupy multiple countries. They occupied Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Panama. They controlled governments, collected taxes, and installed puppet regimes. The Monroe Doctrine, which had started as a defensive policy to keep Europe out, had become an offensive tool to establish American dominance. And it all traced back to 1895 when America was willing to go to war over Venezuela. But there is a deeper question. Why did America care so much about Venezuela? The answer is not idealism. It was not about protecting a small nation from a bully. It was about gold and about precedent. If Britain could take Venezuelan territory because gold was found there, what would stop Britain or France or Germany from taking other pieces of Latin America whenever they found something valuable? The entire continent would be carved up by European powers. America would be surrounded. The Venezuela crisis was about establishing a line. America was saying this hemisphere is ours. You had your chance when we were weak. That time is over. From now on, if there is going to be an empire in the Americas, it will be an American empire. The irony is thick. The United States had fought a revolution to escape British imperialism. Now, barely a century later, America was becoming an empire itself and kicking Britain out to make room. The Founding Fathers had warned against foreign entanglements and imperial ambition, but by the 1890s, that idealism was dead. America wanted power, and in 1895, America took it. The Venezuela crisis is mostly forgotten today. It is not taught in schools. There are no monuments to it, but it was one of the most important moments in the history of American foreign policy. It was the moment when America announced it was a great power. It was the moment when Britain accepted that its empire had limits. And it was the moment when the Monroe Doctrine stopped being a theory and became a weapon. Today, when we talk about spheres of influence, when we talk about America acting as the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, when we see the U.S. intervening in Latin America, all of that traces back to 1895. The playbook was written then. Tell Europe to stay out. Claim we are protecting freedom. Use that claim to justify our own dominance. Venezuela in 1895 was not about saving Venezuela. It was about establishing American supremacy, and it worked. Britain left, America stayed, and the gold stayed in British hands anyway because the arbitration gave them the land. Venezuela got a moral victory and nothing else, but America got the hemisphere. That was the real prize. The British Empire, which had defeated Napoleon and controlled the seas, retreated from the Americas not because they lost a war, but because they did the math. Fighting America was not worth it. The empire that had risen on the backs of colonies began its long decline in 1895 when it decided that some colonies were not worth keeping if it meant making an enemy of the rising giant across the Atlantic. And that giant never looked back. From that moment on, the Western Hemisphere belonged to the United States. The Monroe Doctrine was no longer a statement, it was a fact, and anyone who doubted it would be reminded by every means in our power